Right, you know.
These are all on YouTube. Yeah. Yeah, we're live. It's the last session, y'all. How you feeling today?
Man, I didn't realize I was as tired as I
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, then but the quinoa was popping.
I had it today too.
Oh, it was
Y'all missed the
cracking.
quinoa salad.
Man, I was cracking.
Is that the jump off for
That,
Little lunch.
man,
CRSEA? The
look,
quinoa salad?
look, that might we need IG pictures of that quinoa salad. For real, for real. Sometimes it's the simple things.
So this is not live yet, right? Or this is live right now?
We are live.
Oh, okay.
Say hello, world. Whose world is it? Enrique, would you mind trying to shepherd the folks in? Si hay gente, no sé si se fueron ya.
And can you all see if there's people virtually? Does it show on your screen?
We don't see anybody, but we can see y'all.
Yeah,
But there are people in the room, I think.
we can see we can see y'all.
Thank you, Enrique.
And then we got this fresh little interface that that the questions pop up. That interface is kind of flicky.
I was telling them I'm so short, I have a hard time seeing that monitor.
Yeah, that is
No, we won't get discouraged. I just think we need to play some music or something.
For real, right? I think we should start.
we got folks filing in. Well, peace and greetings, everybody. Thank you for rocking with us to the end. My name is Dave Stovall, and I am here with my comrades who will introduce themselves momentarily. And we are the Chicago chapter of what is known as the People's Education Movement. And the People's Education Movement is a collection of classroom teachers, K-12, university professors, community organizers, community members, students, family members who are all committed to a practice that engages our broader community with the possibilities of what education could look like. And what it is that we will talk to you all about today in the title of the presentation, we do this, only us will free us. And what that means is we have to be clear about the practices of self-determination in our communities. And one of the ways in which that comes out is through education. And because we are at the Critical Race Studies and Education Conference, one of the things that becomes important is how we understand critical race praxis. And my responsibility today is to give a brief understanding of critical race praxis and how it relates to people's education work. Eric Yamamoto in 1993 wrote a law review article about some work that he was doing with some of his students in a legal clinic in Los Angeles. And they were working with garment workers who were organizing themselves around wage theft. And when they started to talk about their work and what they needed legally, Eric Yamamoto's law students began to move around this particular practice. And they assisted that group of garment workers in Los Angeles to organize themselves, but they also noticed deep racial tensions between groups. So it was Black folks from Los Angeles, it was folks from El Salvador, it was folks from Mexico, it was folks from the Philippines, and a couple of other countries were represented in that grouping. And the work to get them all on the same page, Eric Yamamoto began to refer to it as race praxis. And one of the things around critical race praxis that Yamamoto put forward was, we need to spend less time with abstract theorizing and more time on the ground with people experiencing injustice. And he came up with 4 components from his work with that legal clinic and other formations across the country, because he started with the legal clinic in Los Angeles, but he's done this work in Hawaii. He's also done this work here on the East Coast. And those 4 components of the work are, the first is the conceptual. So what is it that you are trying to do? How do you create that and make that conceptually viable to the work that you're trying to do? The second one is the material. What resources do you need to enact what you have conceived? The third one is the performative. Now that you have come up with the concept, now that you have secured the resources needed to enact that concept, what are you actually doing in the day-to-day work of that formation? And then the last part is the reflexive. So now that you have settled on your concept, you now have your material, you have now done the work. Now, what do you do to evaluate it in the sense of what went well, what did not go well, and what do you need to improve? So now what we will talk about today is a program that enacted those 4 tenets, but also looked at what does it mean to do intergenerational work responsibly. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you all.
Thanks, Dave. I'll go ahead and go next, just for easeability, and then I'll pass the mic to our folks online. Welcome everybody again. Thanks for hanging to the end. Erika Davila here, and really excited to talk about this project. And I did not tell Val to give us a shout out at the end of the session if you were there, but that is the program we're talking about. So Valentina's her mom. We do a lot of intergenerational work, and I was like, did you tell her to say that? So what I wanted to share was a little bit about connecting this idea of CRP to testimonial and other pieces of work that kind of guide our praxis as educators. All of us are based in universities, even though we have different kinds of positions, but we spent sometime this summer, and we do different projects too with different age groups. But this summer specifically, in 21 with some high schoolers. So that's what we're going to draw on. But I wanted to connect again this like idea of the critical race praxis to the Sojourno summer program, which we're referencing. And this summer, our curriculum was rooted in the lived history of the late Mayor Harold Washington of Chicago, our first Black mayor, and also known as the People's Mayor. And all of us have different lived realities around the time in the 80s when he was elected. And some of us remember being children, going to different events. Some of us remember being a little, older, depending, on the age of the folks and what that meant for their positionality, So again, you might have just been a shorty that your mom dragged along, or you might have been the person dragging somebody along. And so two kind of conceptual things I wanted to talk about. One was making sense of the world. When I think of the work that we do in critical race praxis, really trying to center the youth and their lived realities. To me, it really is about that, right? Like these are young folks who are in the very literally the same spaces because a lot of them went to one of the high schools where Harold Washington spoke. And so we were basically kind of reliving that history through their lens, right? So what does it mean for you all to be in 2021, to be young folks and literally stand on that land, stand in that space where that struggle happened and that victory, because it really was a victory for the city. And it was a great loss when he passed. But it was a huge moment. And one of the things I remember as a kid when the Harold Washington movement happened was this a Black and brown solidarity. So Harold Washington, he came to the barrio, like he, reached out to the Latino community in Chicago in a very specific kind of way, and other communities too. And he was also very, one of our youth this summer did this project around, his advocacy for the LGBTQ community. And for a Black man in the 80s, that really wasn't heard of. And so that was also very revolutionary, which leads me to this next conceptual idea I wanted to talk about, which is this testimonials as counter narratives, drawing on Lozano's work. And then the other piece is this idea of, like our title suggests, this for us, by us, right? So we're all very transparent and clear about our own positionalities, growing up in the city, going to Chicago public high schools, and what does it mean to them work with the youth who are in those positionalities now. And some of the work that we draw on, and I always think of this like, like all the ish, right? So thinking of like Bettina Love's work, The Spirit Murder, Dave's work, School to Prison Nexus. Me and my prima wrote about Anna Vilas, who's in the house, the context of the Chicago public schools using a CRT lens, right? So we looked at things like access to early childhood education. Our communities were on wait lists. We did research in the early 2000s, and we found after having to FOIA CPS. I know we have CPS people in the house, but this was 20 some years ago. But we basically wanted to know, like, who's on these wait lists to get into early childhood programs. And we found that there was predominantly Latino children and Latino zip codes. We looked at things like high school push out rates and all these kinds of things. So those are the kinds of things that kind of give us, for lack of a better word, like the ammunition, right? El fuego underneath to move us. And then Valentina is actually going to share some of the work that we really, I would say, root ourselves in with that other piece, right? So this work is like problematizing what we see or problem posing, and then really thinking about, how do we move past that? Valentina?
Thank you, Erica. Hi, everyone. My name is Valentina Gamboa Turner, Chicago resident, CPS grad, the Chicago Public Schools alum. And I really just wanted to name a little bit about our work being intergenerational and why we do that. So, being raised by two Chicano activists, all I know is intergenerational work, and that really feeds a lot of our lived reality that Erica presented. Thinking back on the movements that were happening in Chicago from the 60s and the 70s, including the Chicano movement, the Black Liberation Movement, the labor movement that was happening in our city. all of those things really came together under this legacy of Harold Washington that we explore with students, but also under our own practice and pedagogy. So it's really important that we are intentional about being intergenerational, and being intergenerational not in a way of bringing in students to be an afterthought, or bringing in students to be kind of a oh yeah, we'll hear your voice, but really working and building alongside students. And so some of the work around there I think about is this Compañía Trucha, which was a theater group in the 70s that both of my parents, Hector and Maria Gamboa, were part of. And what's really important to understand why I'm referencing the Chicano movement was because that movement was a movement led by young people, but it was also a movement that moved the elders and moved with the elders, trying to maintain our ancestral culture, but also contend with the moment we were living in the United States, and contend with being marginalized, contend with how we were getting inferior access to education in our schools, and getting inferior housing in our communities. So that's our root in popular education, and our root in being intergenerational. It's ancestral. It's connected to how we all have arrived into this moment. Oftentimes, when we're doing our work as a collective, we share stories of our parents, and then we look forward, right? And Dave mentioned our children being part of this, our collective. And our children are part of the collective because we know that from an intergenerational lens, we can learn from any missteps we may have taken in our history, but then also we have our young people along with us so that they can imagine and they can build something new for our future. So that's really a little bit about some of our intergenerational work.
Peace, everybody. And this is Asif here. We see all of this as curriculum. And more specifically, we see the social movements of the past as curriculum that can serve as both content in educational spaces, in and out of schools, and we'll get into that in a minute, but also pedagogical practices, the sorts of exchanges, context of learning that occurred in social movements, whether they occurred last night, this thing around the past is temporal, or in terms of a social movement from the somewhere beyond where young people might be standing in this moment, like the 1980s. And so it's really important here for us to preface, we'll show a clip in a second, but the work around bringing Harold Washington into the classroom is not a biopic endeavor. This work was not about focusing on Harold Washington, a person, or necessarily someone's rise to mayorship, these sort of electoral politics, but more so the social movements, as Valentina just alluded to, that started well before Harold Washington ran for mayor, and the also context of endemic racism that CRT lends us to understand that existed in the city's municipality, its school system, its healthcare system, all parts of Chicago, and how this this movement that elected Harold Washington was navigating the complexities of both of those areas. And so on the one hand, we want folks to think about, as you watch this clip around Harold Washington's election in 1983, one, what's the context, right? Where are the structures, endemic structures, and where is the social movement as a rupture to that? And then related, how might these things, the images that you see, the sounds you hear, the interactions between people, and the contestation of this space serve as curriculum? And that's really the work that we brought into this summer program that we'll get into in a minute. I think we can watch the film now.
You want Harold? Well, here's Harold.
Harold was a dedicated public servant who had strong convictions and pursued them with vigor and courage. He worked toward eliminating the firewall between the various communities, ethnic communities. And although it's still there, there's a lot more movement among various ethnic groups.
We have learned one thing in this generation in Chicago. It is that bossism is not leadership, and leadership is not bossism.
He was just open, inquisitive, and creative, but he knew who he was. The most skilled political leader I've ever dealt with. Barack Obama would have a hard time being on sheer smarter than Harold. And but then in understanding processes and how people are motivated, express themselves, and organize, it's street smarts. Harold is far, far ahead of Obama.
I would describe him as charismatic, very competent. He was the man for that moment, 1980s. He came at the end of a long struggle for African-American rights in Chicago, starting in the 50s and coming through the 60s, and sort of culminating with his election in 1983, 84.
Some members of my cabinet will be required to take salaries considerably less than their counterparts are now making. So that there is no confusion, these cuts will begin in the mayor's office.
Harold Washington believed very strongly in fairness and in equity and justice for all. Now that sounds like something very trite, but it was true when it came to him.
When you think about it, really, this audience is what Chicago's all about. I look out there, right. I look out there at 3,000 people. You know what I see? I see 3 million people in Chicago coming together in unison.
The experience of working with his administration changed me. And I'd been in politics for 35 years, gave me a sense of how practically you have to both bring people in and be very skilled at building alliances or isolating your enemies.
Council wars stymied the first 3 years of Washington's first term, with the majority of the city's aldermen opposing his programs, often just because they were his. The council had broken clearly along racial lines.
The President recognizes Alderman Harris.
I move we adjourn.
You've heard the motion. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. Council is adjourned.
I would like to tell all of you that we want Harold here too, but he ran away.
Mr. President, may we proceed with the business of this city council?
He wanted to make the government open. And so the budget before Harold was a secret document like the papal encyclical that only a few people knew about. And so now it's a whole open budget process. Of course, Rahm Emanuel trying to move it back to a more closed process.
He started the 35% requirement on the part of city contracts being given to African Americans and Hispanics. And of course, that number, after he passed, went down.
The issue is, shall we have a new system in which people are involved in the city? We're going to have the old system in which special interests run it to the detriment of the city and for their benefit. That's the issue. There is no other issue.
We see, however, at least the pretense of trying to live up to what he put in place, because he, for instance, put in place the Open Meetings Act. He put in place access on the part of citizens to all kinds of documents that were generated by the city.
I wasn't groomed for mayor. I was assistant corporation counsel. I was a secretary to an alderman. I was a state senator. I was a state representative. I was a congressman. I came up through the machine, broke and went independent. I've been dealing with budgets and appropriations and personnel and departmental heads all my life.
I think Harold Washington just became such a tremendous symbol for the city of Chicago, not only because he became mayor, but because he fought the good fight.
For as much as the spirit of Harold Washington has returned unto God who gave him, we therefore commit his body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Since he was only able to be in office for 4.5 years, he was not able to make many institutional changes in the government. And so there's been a step back from it. But it took Richie Daley 10 years before he gave up Harold's slogans like Chicago works together.
Whereas there's been an increase in the number of Black elected officials, I don't think that those officials are as aggressive in their pushing of Black ideas and Black interests as they were during the Harold Washington administration. Well, he enjoyed representing Chicago. He said, I want to make sure we change the image of Chicago, not as a gangster town, but as a town of diversity and a town of progressive people.
Chicago, Chicago, my hometown.
Over the next 10 years, Comcast is committing $1 billion to reach 50 million low-income Americans with the tools and resources they need to be.
We're working on it. Asif, you ready? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so again just going back to the questions I posed before we played the video. What structures were in place that you saw this social movement that elected Harold Washington go up against? What was Harold Washington as part of a justice project up? How was Harold Washington navigating in the collective? And then I think what you don't see in that film is there was a lot of mention around what Harold did. Well, we have to remember that what Harold did was bound in what the people needed. And Harold was a very people-oriented person. Like when you talk to elders around Harold about Harold, there are memories of like Harold being at their crib eating dinner because Harold was a people-centered person. And I think that's all what led up to this summer program that the four of us plus a number of other people helped coordinate, where we tried to bring this somewhat distant social memory. Remember, Robin Kelly reminds us that social movements of the past are oftentimes distant intentionally because they are feared because they can cause a rupture in the status quo. And so young bloods nowadays in Chicago oftentimes don't know the story of Harold Washington or the story of their community's agency or the story of their community's intergenerational exchange or the story of their community's connection with other communities in a very segregated city. And so we try to bring some of those memories into this 5-week program that my colleagues will share more about.
Thanks, Asif. So I'm going to provide just a little bit of the framework about how we went about this project. So first, I have to start by saying that Erica and I worked on the project 1 year prior, and it was the first summer that we were in quarantine. So Eric and I definitely understood that we were going to have to really create a space. It was virtual, but we had to create a space, and we centered healing in our work that summer. So we were very intentional. And I want to just take a moment to talk about that word intentional, because I hear people use it a lot. And honestly, it's kind of driving me crazy. Let me give you an example of intentional based on Anne Aviles, who's there. We're in her institution, something that she mentioned in her workshop yesterday. Intentional is what they are doing in their work, where they're looking at the income, they're paying the folks that are doing the research for them based on the income level that's necessary in order to have stable housing. That's intentional. That's looking at what the market really is and what people really need, and making sure that there's equity in how we support and fund folks in doing this work with us, writing curriculum or being scholars or researchers. So I just wanted to put something on that, because I think a lot of folks use the word intentional and they conflate what it really means. And then so going back, Eric and I wanted to be intentional about bringing healing. And then came the second summer. And Audrey Petty, who is the founder of the Sojourner Scholars, is also a super intentional woman. And she reached out to Asif independently, because Asif has been connected to this work around Harold here in Chicago, also working with city colleges, with the city college with his name attached to it. So he has made a name for himself, and so she went to him, and Asif, being an intentional scholar, in my opinion, brought it back to our collective and the work that we've been trying to build together around creating education that lives not only in the academic spaces, but lives in all of our community spaces as well. So Asif comes in and he shares the idea with us. And every part of the way we did our work was intentional, as from the point of how we divvied up the funding, how we were equitable, and who got what based on the amount of labor and time we were able to commit to this project. It was intentional, and these were the acts that we were doing. As we went through the project, we also wanted to create a teaching team. And so the framework that we utilized in our teaching team was that every summer, Audrey has alum from the Sojourner Scholars come back and teach with whoever the faculty or community organizer she brings in for her summer project. So we pulled in, we had two alums from the Sojourner Scholars. So these are students that have been through the program. Then we also implemented a mentor level. And this is where we wanted to bring other young people in. And some of you had an opportunity to hear from Benjamin and Valentina, and they were our mentor level students. Then the other level we had was community scholars. And I wanted to shout out our colleague, Ananka, who's unable to be with us today, but she's a community scholar. She's the founder of the Revolutionary Motherhood. She's the director of the anti-eviction campaign. She is a cultural maker, and she is a great community leader and healer here in Chicago, and I would say, nationally as well. And then myself as an educator, a community scholar, but not necessarily an academic. We're intentional about making these different levels of folks coming together. And then, of course, we have our very established scholars, Dave and Erica and Asif, who their scholarship is connected to CRT and connected to liberatory education. So bringing all of these pieces together was important, and this was our structure. But it's not something to think that it happens um, kind of like on the fly. It takes a lot of labor. It takes a lot of organizing, and it takes a lot of trust, which our colleagues will talk a little bit more about as we continue. So, Asif or Erica.
I could jump in. A few of the practices that, just building on what Valentina said about summer 2020, when her and I did the program, and then 21 when we had our teaching team. We had a team in 20, but it was not as layered. And we were not 100, right? Like it's like it was summer 2020, right? So we were all like, what? And we got to engage high school students, but it was amazing, like the community that we were able to build online. Like honestly, I was very suspect of it, but the youth showed up and showed out, and we really just tried to center them. Like this summer with Harold Washington, as Asif was saying, a lot of them didn't even know, their nice. So of course we were like, go talk to your mama, go talk to your auntie. But it was amazing how seeing, so the Illinois Humanities, who funds the program, they gave all the scholars, all the high school scholars, a picture book, this beautiful picture book of Harold Washington, the movement of Harold Washington. So there were all these beautiful glossy photos. And so we did a lot of stuff where we, because sometimes it's hard for folks to show their camera. So we were trying to get them, not necessarily to show their face, but like they were literally like looking at the pictures and then showing them, on camera and stuff like that. But then there were like, that's my, there was like, oh, that's my high school, right? Like that's Simeon. So that mattered, right? They connected to that. And then the story became more and more part of their story, right? And then the thing that I really, really loved was their final kind of exhibition, right, of what they learned over the summer. And we wanted to share some of the pieces, but we also wanted to make sure that we had the right permissions. And so we decided not to, because of course that's the most important, right? It's their intellectual property. But this is work that we're building on. So hopefully, we will be able to share it because it was brilliant. Actually, just today I was sharing with Dave and one of our colleagues about one of the poems. So they wrote poems, they did TikToks, flyers. So they took the flyers like from the 80s and made them like current day flyers, trying to like really connect like to their ways of knowing, their ways of understanding. And then it was like, it just like took off. So Benjamin, who some of you heard earlier, like every day, 'cause we would meet every day, y'all, Monday to Friday. He would bring in clips, of the Harold Washington movement. And they really just took the bull by the horns and just started like sharing. We're like, yes, this is what we were hoping for. And then the other piece I wanted to talk about was the community scholars, right? So probably every other day, so a lot, pretty often, we brought folks in because we know it's like they're going to get bored, no matter what we have up our sleeve. So we bring in people like Dave and people like Anna Vilez, who we talked about earlier, Ananka, to talk about things that weren't not necessarily part of the quote unquote curriculum, but just things that we thought high school youth of color, they were all Black students, the Black high school students in Chicago needed, right? So it was things like, talking about jobs and, entrepreneurship in ways that are not rooted in capitalism, right? Like, how do you grow your own community assets, right? And so that was really powerful because it gave them a different vision. Because as we know, a lot of youth, they've been socialized, right, around that coin, right? They're like, we just need to make that money, So really flipping it and saying, okay, but how do you then reinvest that money into your communities? And what Valentina said earlier was really critical. Like the Illinois Humanities, pays the youth, right? So they get paid for this. So this is really, to me, that's how, it should be, right? Because we're growing with these young folks in this space. And it's like, we can't just take, right? So it's like, it has to be this, give and take, like, okay, what are you getting for it? And we also worked, we knew the reality that some of them, even though they were getting paid, they still had jobs, right? Like all of them worked. And there were some days they're like, because we will meet for 2 hours. So there were some days where like they just couldn't get out of work or whatever. And then, they would miss class or whatever. But then as the program went on, you would see people like at work with their headphones. They wanted to join, right? So they'd be on their phones with their headphones, like, I'm here, y'all, in the car, So it was amazing to see how they wanted to like show up in that space. And then Valentina, do you want to talk a little bit about the card, the practice of the tarjetas?
Sure. Just to bring Ananka back into the space. So Ananka has these beautiful ancestor cards that an artist created, and they have different symbols as that are rooted in African culture. And every day when we met, we would pull a card collectively, and we would share the meaning. And there are beautiful meanings behind each card that are very deep and very connected um, to basically affirming things of our culture, or to thinking about the ways we move in the world, very spiritually based. So she would share that, and the students really loved that. And it was so crazy because every time she chose a card, it was so reflective of what we were unpacking that day in class. It was a lot of synergy in that moment. And then we would alternate, right? So when we're talking about having the students in, it was a co-development of the curriculum and co-teaching. So we would have the students teach our opening. We always had an opening activity, and so we would take turns with each of our students to kind of lead that. And that was a great experience and practice for our students to be, and for us to be learners, right? For them to teach and for us to be learners in that moment. We also made sure, as Erica mentioned, we were really leaning into creativity. So we utilized poetry, we utilized music. We always had a song selection that the students would bring into the space. When we looked at pictures, and then Asif and Benjamin would bring clips from Harold's, from the time of his election and his his residency or his mayorship, we would have clips. And that was very important in kind of bringing us into that moment. And students would notice things like fashion and the music and, what was happening. So this was a great way to make the curriculum come alive in our space.
Thanks, Valentina. So just a question for those that are in the audience. There's the textbook industry in the U.S. is multi-billion-dollar industry per year. What state exponentially produces more textbooks than others? Where are most of our textbooks coming from?
You got a correct answer, Asif, in the audience from Texas.
Texas. And what's even the situation? What's the context of Texas in this moment? Right? You're talking about a state that doesn't allow words like constitution or slavery in social studies textbooks, and the sorts of influence they might have on social studies and other disciplinary curricular experiences for students in K-12 schools and beyond, really, across the U.S. or Turtle Island. And so this brings us to another question I think we're wrestling with as we reflect back on the program is what is possible in the confines of the traditional schoolhouse, and then what role do we have in intervening through a third space? And so this program that occurred this summer did not take place in a schoolhouse. We met online, and it was organized and funded through a nonprofit statewide entity. And so we're trying to think about what is this navigation, much like Huey Newton, like in the survival programs of the Black Panther Party. Like, how do we meet the immediate needs of the sailor stranded in the middle of the sea, right? And we can equate that to young bloods in hostile situations. And given the work of Bettina Love and Williams and Stove that articulate schools as hostile spaces that not only murder our physical bodies, but murder our spirits. Like, what do we do to intervene in the immediate moments where young bloods are being harmed? And so for us, that's knowing that we have a responsibility to engage in this intergenerational work, to bring folks and build tables where folks can make those sorts of contributions, where we can unearth and document the local social movements, and then like what our role is in bringing those to young people. And so like this summer program for us is not just a summer program where we were able to engage in this curricularization of social movements, but a space where we actually were thinking about our responsibility as justice-centered scholars, activists, community organizers in intervening in a very hostile climate that young bloods are going through. And you could feel it from those moments Erica was describing, when young people are at the gig, but they want to tune into class because they're getting valuable information about Herald, where they're trusted, where they feel safe, where they can be vulnerable, and where they're having a lot of fun. And that's kind of our third point here, is that this work around the justice movement, and we're learning this from local organizations here in Chicago, that joy can be resistance and joy can be healing, and resistance is healing, and those things are interchangeable. And I think we maybe some of the people who are getting a little older, I got like some gray hairs and shit popping off here. So like we come from in Chicago in Saul Alinsky sort of mechanism of organizing, which amongst other things really means like put all that shit on the line and do it out of martyrdom. And if you got to die for this shit, then you got to die for this shit. And I think what young people, one of the videos we wanted to play for y'all today was one of the co-facilitators who happened to also do some curriculum building around Harold Washington, saying, my advice to teachers is make this stuff fun. Can you stop making it so damn boring and engage us? And so have we not trusted young people? And I know that's something like, oh, make it fun. Of course, who wouldn't know to make education fun? But what was behind that was like, how are all parts, Stove and others write about a centering of justice, right? Meaning that we center justice in all that we engage in. And the same goes, I think, for this comment that this young blood's name is Curtis around making it fun. How are we engaging in joy, which is also resistance and healing in all of our pedagogical processes in and out of school spaces? And so like that theme is really, I think, meaningful for me, especially as a person who's like trapped in academia, where I'm supposed to grind, get, exhaust, die, right? Much like the Saul Alinsky organizing teaches us to do or has taught me to do in the streets. And so I think this piece around trusting young people, bringing young people into positions where we can co-lead together through intergenerational exchange, a illumination of social movements of a past that can provide roadmaps to the future, is also like healing for us in that space too, right? And so it's not like, oh, we're just creating space for young bloods. No, we're creating spaces for ourselves. And that's not like out of selfishness. I think that's just out of what the space does for what this context of learning that sits outside of the nexus of schools and this carceral system that they reproduce, something that's more joyous, something that's more liberatory, and something that's more healing.
So I don't know if we have Curtis's video uploaded, but I'm gonna work on it. If maybe we could open it up, take a few questions while we do the tech part. Did you want to share that next, Asif? Oh, I just wanted to make sure.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah,
Work.
we can.
I was assistant corporation counsel. I was a secretary to an alderman. I was a state senator. I was a state representative. I was a congressman. I came up through the machine, broke and went independent. I've been dealing with budgets and appropriations and personnel and departmental heads all my life. That's the background.
I proudly and humbly accept, on behalf of the people of Chicago, the nomination of the Democratic candidate for mayor of
And so,
I don't think this is the clip. I'm sorry.
I know what gang warfare is. I know what hatred is. I know what street confrontation is. I live with the problem of young boys and girls being destroyed by debilitating drugs or things of that nature. So this is no game with me. This is my life. This is what I was made to do, grapple with these problems. I have done so all of my life, long before I even assumed that I would ascend to Congress, much less the mayor of the city. But it's no game with me. It may be a game with others, but not me.
I didn't mean to paint it as a game. What
Well,
I'm asking you is,
I want to make clear where I'm coming from, which is very...
If you said you were Chicago, someone would make the crack. Al Capone, rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat. That was the time when you said Chicago, and someone would respond like a Pavlovian dog, segregation. Or you said Chicago, and people talked about the 1968 riots, or said Chicago was where everyone went who didn't want to be anybody.
Sorry, y'all. That was the wrong video, but it was still good, right? That was another montage that actually Benjamin made for us. So I was glad we got to share a little bit of it. We're trying to load up the reflection that Asif referred to by Curtis. Sorry about that. We had a little technological glitch. Anybody on the panel want to share anything, or should we open it up for questions?
Well, one more point that I wanted to make in connection to what Asif raised, and I don't think I hit on that when we talked about intergenerational work. And the point that I want to make is that one of the main things that we wanted to do, and I don't know if we quite hit the mark, but we're working on it, is to help young people also understand that Harold Washington was one person that was part of a collective, a movement. So we really wanted to move away from this one idea that you need one like hero, particularly a male hero to kind of save the day. We wanted to make sure we understood what the collective part was. So that's why we also brought in different voices, including indigenous voices from Chicago. We tried to raise up the legacies of women. I don't know if we did as good a job as we could have. I think we can do better. But understanding that, what all led to this moment with Harold, and understanding that he was up against a machine that, because of its repression, that the movement was happening, and he was riding the wave, and he was the right person in the right time, but it was a movement that was resisting the machine that we were facing here in the city of Chicago. So I just wanted to say that is another level of the work that I think is not always easy to get. I don't know if we quite got it. I think that's part of praxis, right? Is the reflection piece and trying to see where we can do better. But I really think that we need to bring the focus on the women, such as, Maria Salcedo or Sonia Gaete, or all these other women that have been part of the movement in Chicago and changing the landscape, of our city.
I just want to shout out your mom as well, Maria Gamboa, one of the authors of Chicanas on 18th Street and one of my mentors. So we actually have the video, I think. So we're going to try it. And then after that, we'll open it up, y'all.
Corporation Council. I was a secretary to an alderman. I was a state senator. I was a state representative. I was a congressman. I came up through the machine, broke with independent. I've been
sorry, y'all.
Budgets,
we're trying.
appropriation.
It's okay. It's all right. All right, y'all. We're going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A. If we do get the video going, we'll share it with y'all. And if not, Asif, if you want to give like a quick summary of Curtis's reflection, we could do that too. Questions, comments from the audience, either online or with us in the room?
I don't know how. Can you hear me? Okay. I was just thinking about how you guys shared a little bit about how your personal experience living in the city, growing up in the city, influenced your research. And I'm just wondering how you communicated those experiences to the youth and how they responded to that, what that meant to them to have that personal connection, because I felt like that was really critical to what you were doing.
Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think one of the things that becomes important, I think there are two things in talking with young people and that I think are critical. And I was talking earlier today with Tadic about what it means to do two things in particular. One, to acknowledge that you do not know their life. Right? I think that's really important, right? Because we always want to castigate young people, right? What's wrong with you? Pull up your pants. Why your shoes untied? All that madness, right? And what young people often do when they hear that, they disconnect from you quickly. Another thing is to let young folks see that you understand some things and demonstrate to them that you are actively listening to them. And it's going to sound very simple and basic, but when young people are talking to you and they ask you a question, when you ask something like, let me see if I got this right, and repeating how you understand what it is that they're saying, now gives them a sense that they are actually being listened to, because they live in a world that just wants to box them and not listen to them. Right? So I think those two things really become important, because now you have to, and I guess the third thing, recognizing that there are some things that when you were growing up that are different. So you cannot start your conversation with young folks with what's wrong with y'all. Right? Because that's the easy go-to, right? And then the other part, which is the worst, because it really starts you to lying, right? Well, back in my day, right? That's the easiest way to get into a lie. Well, back in my day, I walked from Delaware to Rhode Island. No, you didn't. Be quiet. Right? So now it's really around how are we able to stay honest in our engagement with them so they can actually see that there are other folks who are concerned about them, making a space for them to feel safe and engage in the way that they do, right? And that takes a little bit, right? It's not something that happens instantaneously. And I think a lot of times people think that, right? But what we're saying is it takes some work. But to Valentina's point, that work has to be intentional.
And this makes me think of the first time I came to visit the scholars this summer. And traditionally, if you're a guest speaker or whatever, you're supposed to deposit information. I think that's the expectation. Deposit information into the people you're going to visit. And instead of doing that, I asked them who they were, where they were from, what's going on in their lives. And I found out that a lot of them went to a high school together, Simeon High School. I happened to have a picture on my file, in my files, of Harold Washington at Simeon High School in 1983. I had a plan for what I was going to try to engage them in, but from that moment I found out they went to Simeon High School. I knew that I could build a point of relevance. And just by showing them a picture, we had a level of engagement through listening authentically and responding with honesty, where I wasn't taking up space, but helping to facilitate a meaningful conversation where they could connect to the memories of the past.
I also think an important factor is that, as a parent, and I have like multiple generations of kids, you have to have relationships if you're going to be a teacher, and not only in your classroom, but outside of your classroom with young people. I mean, if you don't have your own at home, borrow your little cousins. You know what I'm saying? Be a mentor. Like, our title is Only Us Will Free Us. Like, if you really want to be in service and in community with young people, you have to take the time and invest and do the labor of having relationships with young people so it can inform, the way we're engaging with our students. That's my recommendation.
So we do have the video, y'all. If we could pause, do the video, and then we should have a few more minutes for questions. So keep thinking of your questions.
I think you might need to fast forward to like 40 seconds.
Hey, you all. My name is Curtis Atkins. I'm actually a former college graduate of Harold Washington. And today I'll actually be answering a few questions today about Harold Washington, the 83andMe project. All right. So as far as my experience, it was very fun. First of all, very fun, adventurous, and informative. Now, man, it was definitely a lot of work, a lot of groundwork we had to do. We researched actually in Harold's library, which is also a big library at Harold Washington College. And then we actually got access to his archives at the Harold Washington Library. And that was another fun experience. We also saw newspapers of what he was doing, bringing people together, joining so many events. He was so involved. Like, I saw him even at the Pride, parade. And, that wasn't really big, back in the 80s. Like, a lot of people wasn't showing that support to the LGBTQ community. So that was very awesome to me. And also, I also like how he really stood for us financially. Like, he was planning on doing budget cuts even from his own cabinet, people that was working with him. He wanted to cut their budgets just to help the city out, to bring more resources and opportunities to these impoverished communities around Chicago. And that was just very dope to me. Again, this guy was just so awesome. So the second thing that I want to speak about is what I discovered as far as the social movements. And what I discovered was really Harold forming these calling for leadership in communities and bringing people together by doing so. And actually, one person that was participating in calling for leadership in one of those communities was the young Barack Obama. Now, this definitely was the young Barack Obama because he still had an afro and all those things. And, you know, he was young and he looked up to Harold, and I can definitely see some resemblance as far as the care for people, him being very articulate and just being, you know, the people's person, you know, and that correlates to Harold Washington so much. All right. And I'm also going to speak about the third question, what I actually learned about myself. What I learned about myself is that I'm actually a natural leader. Like Harold myself, I care about the youth. You know, things aren't always easy growing up in Chicago by, you know, the amount of gang violence that goes on and the drug usage and drug sales and just being a product of your environment, being able to rise. You know, he rose by being the mayor and giving back to his people. I rose when I became an adult and got access to certain things and been able to help certain people out that need it. So I feel like I really connect to Harold on that level as far as reaching a position and obtaining it by putting your people on, essentially. That's what I'm saying. All right. So the next one is what advice would I give teachers about this type of curriculum that me, Asa, and a few others that created? I would say just have fun. Have fun, but also create some realism about life, you know, things that correlate to today as far as, you know, us needing leader, somebody that's a leader, somebody that can actually lead the people to, you know, whatever they need as far as their needs, that they need peace, that they need resources, that they need financial stability, those type of things. Just being a leader. I feel like I was about to be like Martin Luther King right now. I have a dream. But yeah, I would say just pull information that students will love to expand on. I would say that. And the last question, yes. What was the best memory that I had during this whole project? So actually the best memory was Asif coming up to me one day. I was actually working with Asif. I was still one of his interns around this time. And he came up to me, he was like, hey dude, we gotta present in front of Harold's old campaign team. They're gonna be here, news outlets, all this stuff. And I'm just like, wow. And you want me to go up there and speak about Harold and how much I like this dude and all this stuff. And yeah, you know, but I was able to do it. I was like, yeah, come on, man, let's do it. Yeah, let's go. So I actually created a poem about Harold, and it was very, very creative. I think that it was very timely. I tried to time myself and see how long I took, and I actually took about like an hour to put it together. And I just thought to myself and listened to some music and really try to expand and create that connection that I always felt that I had with Harold. But yeah, I believe I answered all the questions. And as far as that, thank you all for letting me speak again. I love the fact that I'm a co-author of a curriculum about Harold Washington, the mayor himself. And I'm just so humbled that I'm still involved and still being able to participate in many things relating to this project. And I appreciate you guys. Have a great day and take it easy. All right, bye-bye.
I mean, the interesting thing about Curtis is when Curtis started the project, he didn't even know who Harold Washington was.
Mhm.
You know, and to build that sort of connection, that agency, that sense of belonging, and community, I think is just like, you know, pretty powerful and illuminates what connecting young people to social movements of the past might do for the future.
Absolutely. All right, y'all. We could we only have a few minutes left, but if there are other questions for anybody on the panel or just for the space.
I can ask one.
Go for it.
I just want to thank Asif and Valentina and Dave and Erika for sharing this work. I'm currently in San Antonio, so the first thing I started thinking about, I remember when the mayor passed away. I was really, really, really young. Just joking. But in San Antonio, I'm from South Texas. In San Antonio, Henry Cisneros became the first Mexican-American mayor in 1981. Harold Washington became the first Black mayor of Chicago in 83. So I'm kind of thinking about what that means for, you know, my context. But I had a question about the third space that Asif mentioned and sustainability. How can you sustain this type of work that's very intensive, labor intensive? It's very it's about building relationships, trusting relationships with youth. How do you do this throughout the school year, if possible? And how do you do it in a way that can align with possibly teachers that are already trying to do this work as part of their daily practice? I know it can be problematic to go within the school, and the things that are happening within our schools don't always lend itself to doing this kind of work. But have you thought about building this kind of work as a sustainable partnership, as a sustainable collective within the school site with the teachers who are already trying to do this work?
This is a perfect opportunity to put up the People's Ed email. So I think working in the collective space of the People's Education Movement helps. So we see it as it doesn't really end, right? So even bringing in like Valentina and Benjamin, who are on our youth panel, and really just integrating them into our work. So we mentioned Valentina and I have worked in the program in summer 2020, where we really leveraged their oral family history. So they all interviewed like family members, and we anchored our work in Bell Hook's work in the home place. And it was really powerful. And one of the young women who was one of our TAs, her, Valentina, and I co-wrote a piece that's going to be published, and we're so excited on thinking about how we use Black feminism and the home place specifically to teach as pedagogy. Her name's Miranda Gooseby, just to shout her out. So thinking about how, again, we envelope them into the space, right? It's not neat and clean, right? It's not like we have a timeline or a schedule, and, you know, some kids or youth will stay more connected than others, right? So it's not neat and clean, but just really thinking how, you know, we bring them into our work, and they'll bring us into theirs too, right? Like, because it's just this shared community. And then just back to what Valentina shared earlier about the intergenerational piece, right? So I think that piece, it just like, as we're planning this session, which Ananka Shoni was also part of our planning process, who's Benjamin's mom. So it's just very natural and organic, right? So if we're on shared spaces, right? And so it's like, oh, tell Benjamin to call me back, right? Or tell Val, whatever, right? So it's just this way of being more of a familia, right? So it's not so much like, you know, again, a structured way of staying connected. It's not perfect, right? Because that is a really important question, right? Like, how do we sustain that? But we just try to model like what we've learned from working with, you know, our parents and other family members, and just kind of staying connected, checking in on folks, knowing like people dip out sometimes and they come back. And that's just part of the work too. So.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it was a good question. You know, and it comes interrogated and agitated and transformed through a number of, I think, mechanisms. I think on the one hand, teachers need spaces to better understand the supremacist roots in their civic engagement practices and their social studies pedagogies in classrooms. And we're fortunate enough in a state like Illinois, and there are other states that have revised their standards, particularly in social studies, to move away from content. Like if you look at the Illinois social studies standards, there's not one requirement for content.
Nope.
There is 100% requirement to create space for K-12 students to ask questions, collect information about those questions, do something about that information. And so I think we've got to agitate teachers to do more. We got to produce scholarship that better understands why they're not, and then figure out what we can do to mediate that in and out of school. I think right now it's like, okay, what do we do in the third space? And then how do we organize teachers through mechanisms like People's Ed to better understand, build frameworks of analyses, and then to engage in more liberatory curriculum in their classrooms, because there are opportunities. I mean, the structures, at least through the standards, that doesn't account for the structures. And in Chicago, we hired, out of all people, McGraw-Hill last summer, $34 million to create mandatory curriculum for all subjects in all grade levels. And so we're up against a constant maneuvering. But if we don't make sense of what we're up against, I think then we might just reproduce it unknowingly. And then maybe that's the case in a lot of these history classrooms and social science classrooms in P20 spaces.
And let me just say for the record, the social studies curriculum that comes out of that McGraw-Hill, as if I mess up the name, is it Timeline? Skyline. It is a piece of shit. Like, it is horrible. I mean, it is one of the worst curricular examples and theft by a corporation in a broader school district, to the point where the social studies division wasn't even told that they were going to purchase this particular curriculum. Social studies division looked at it, said it was trash, they kept it anyway. So this thing around really understanding that, and to your question, Enrique, I think one of the other things is that we have to really start to think about, and this is something that I haven't even said to my comrades, what does it mean to think about sustainable fugitivity, right? And to really begin to say, all right, if we keep our work fugitive, meaning that it adjusts to the needs of people, it does not necessarily have a physical material home, but it rests in the work that we train people up to do. How do we maintain that in the various spaces in which we operate? And is there sustainability in terms of the relationships and the execution of the work, like Asif was talking about in that space? Because we can go on the relationships and how, families oscillate and the like, but it's also this thing around when we know these things don't work and we see what young folks are going through and trying to navigate. What does it mean now to say, all right, we can move around in this space to do something else, right? And can we train folks? This is always the question I have of teacher ed. Can we train folks up to move fugitively, right? And I think it's a very different space, because you have to release yourself from the confines of schooling. Now, that's hard as hell to do in a school, right? So this thing around really being clear about that, because I do think it's a different type of training, but we got precedent on people who have done it. But it's a different type of work, right? I can't express how different it is, because now you're working with a very different purpose. Right. And we've seen it, like Gloria Lasson-Billings tells a story where she was a pre-service teacher at Lincoln University, right outside of Philly. And she had a professor who asked them a question that they had to answer every day. And the question was, what have you done for the struggle? And getting up is not an option. Right? So that type of training, can we not necessarily return to that, but can we learn from that in terms of creating those spaces where we can move in different ways in that third space that Asif talked about?
Sorry, Erica, go ahead.
It's not good. I know we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to say something based on what Dave said. One of the youth who spoke with us earlier, Anthony Pochel, he talked about, right, challenging his teachers, right? So I also think it's, again, not so linear. So like when we build in these spaces, like we hope that those young folks are going to be in those spaces and they're going to resist, right? They're going to say, wait a minute, and they're going to challenge that shitty curriculum, right? And say, this isn't accurate, right? So we're trying to work together, right? Because vice versa, right? So they give me language. So when I'm at the university meeting, I'm like, wait a minute, right? And so again, just trying to build that way. And it's, again, not neat and clean, not linear, but I do think that if there's a ripple, and that these young folks will speak up. I mean, that's what I pray for. At least. Valentina, you want to close us out?
Yeah, I just wanted to say when we're talking about classroom spaces, a part that is often forgotten is our families, right? Our caretakers, our parents, grandparents. I think it's really important as teachers are developing curriculum to lean into families and communities, and that's not always so easy, especially when we know that the majority of our teachers do not represent the student populations that they teach. However, as Asif's saying, it's important that they become aware of that, of their own positionality, and they challenge themselves to grow and they challenge themselves to engage our communities, because there's so much history, there's so much knowledge from our elders, from the community, that's not validated. That's why I use the term community scholars, because I'm not an academic, and I've often felt like my analysis wasn't important. But I just kept going and I kept connecting with people. Audrey Petty and she was my teacher in my undergrad 20 plus years ago. And we crossed paths 20 years later. And she pulled me into this program. Like when you're on this path of movement building, you will reconnect. You will you will have your times you're on your own path, but there is some kind of synergy. There is some kind of momentum when you're doing this type of work in cities like San Antonio or Chicago or anywhere where you might be based. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. All right, folks, that's a wrap. We have our presidential reception. Thank you again to Asif and Valentina for joining us from Chi-Town.
Did we get cut? They got cut off, I think.
Cut off. All right. Well,
I think we're still